film helped build the Nazis, expose them, and still shapes the way that they're remembered. Goebbels, the chief propagandist, controlled the German film industry, and he used cinema to bypass reason and create the imagined Volksgemeinschaft. Well, he always filmed Hitler as this messianic figure, always shot from below, so always seeming larger than life. And then at Nuremberg, justice and cinema worked side by side. The trial itself became this moral drama for the world to have access to see. And then the black and white footage of the concentration camps that the Allies captured became the most irrefutable and devastating evidence. And since then, Hollywood has reinvented the Nazi as a caricature villain, satirically, or pushed them to the edges in films that try to recenter the victims, like Schindler's List or Life is Beautiful. Some films try to examine the perpetrators themselves, and the new Nuremberg film sits squarely in that space. The final frame of it has this quote, which is from my favourite historian, R.G. Collingwood, and it's, "The only clue to what man can do is what man has done." So when an actor steps into the skin of a Nazi, they're shaping how millions are going to imagine cruelty and its warning, because most people don't get their history from books or archives, they get it from film. So that carries a responsibility and a kind of danger and revelation, especially if you're playing someone like Hermann Goring. And my next guest has done exactly that. Brian Cox, thank you so much for joining us on History Uncensored. Welcome.
You're welcome.
One of the reasons that we're chatting today is about the process and your portrayal of Hermann Goring in Nuremberg, the miniseries that came out in 2000, which is considered one of the definitive portrayals, and rightly so. You won an Emmy for it. There have been many attempts to analyze and understand Goring's psychology. He is a complex man. We also know that he had substance abuse issues, although he seemed to be able to wean himself off fairly effectively when he was in Nuremberg, but paracodeine.
Well, actually,
predominantly.
it was his jailers who weaned him off it. It was the worst thing they did, because he became so clear because of the substances that he was been suffering from. And in fact, that was the problem. That was the problem.
Yeah.
If they'd left him alone, they would have ran circles around him. And if he hadn't cleared himself, he would not have been able to take Jackson on the journey through the whole rise of National Socialism.
I think that is one of the fascinating elements of the law of unintended consequences. But they wanted a fair trial, and so therefore that was the priority. But I'm curious, how did you get into the psychology of him? Because obviously Douglas Kelly, Gustav Gilbert, they analysed him in person. Subsequently, people have tried to. We know there was abuse of substances, but there's debate about whether or not he was pathological with very strong aggressive narcissistic traits, or was he more ordinary but ruthless? How did you get into his mindset?
Well, I think he was definitely a bit of a showman as much as anything else, Goering. But also he was not intrinsically nasty. He really wasn't. That would be hard to find. But he was clear about how Germany should be shaped. Very clear and very passionate about that, and believed that Hitler was the man to run the show. Towards the end of the war, he never lost his faith in Hitler. He always believed that Hitler would come right in the end. And of course, that's where he was severely mistaken. And he couldn't see the fact, he couldn't really get it was very hard for him to get a sense of Hitler's own particular madness, because he was mad in his own way as well. So it was always very hard to get a proportion on that. And he followed them. He'd made this plea. He came back after suffering a severe nervous breakdown. He came back from Sweden, and came back to really do the job of, helping Hitler become the Führer, as he did. And there's no question about it. His organizational skills were absolutely brilliant. That was his gift. And he believed that possibly National Socialism was the answer to that was the lecture he gave Jackson. And Jackson, he just ran circles around Jackson. And it was the history about how out of the Treaty of Versailles, they were punished so badly. And that was that's the root of why Hitler came about, because if we hadn't punished the Germans so badly, a sort of revenge thing, we might not have had the rise of Hitler, and certainly not, we wouldn't have had Goring coming back from Sweden to work with him. So there's a lot of elements which contribute to the character of Goring.
There's one scene in particular that really struck me. They're all very powerful in your performance. And it's the one where Goring is in the cell with Gustav Gilbert, the US psychiatrist. And Goring is claiming that the atrocities, of course, bother him and that he's a man of war and practicality. And you play that very convincingly, as if we're supposed to be convinced. And then he discovers that Gilbert is Jewish, and you see the character turn on a dime and have this curiosity but also amusement that speaks to a lack of empathy. And I thought that was interesting and makes me wonder if you were playing him like he believed his own logic or like he was calculated and ruthless and lacking in empathy.
I think it's a collection of all those things. I do think he follows his own logic. But I also think he was quite naughty. He could be quite naughty, Goering, about how he kind of moved things around. He was a brilliant politician in that way, absolutely brilliant. You know, his great love was for the UK. He never wanted to invade the UK, for example, because he thought the UK, he felt the UK gave them, it was the UK that gave him the example of concentration camps. That came directly from the UK, from what they did in the Boer War. So it was an interesting development. And in that scene with Gilbert, it's a fascinating scene because he touches on something, and the anti-Semitism, and this is what one doesn't really understand the level of what that anti-Semitism was. And it was also to do with businesses that were allowed to continue, that the Germans couldn't deal with. And they always had that power. So that was that power that they didn't like. And it was much more about economic thing than really about religion, more than anything else, I think. And of course, it's become now about religion and anti-Semitism. But it wasn't initially about that. It was about how he felt the Jews had kind of undermined, whether it's right or wrong, I'm not saying, but he felt the Jews had undermined what was going on in the rise of Hitler. And Hitler, of course, was anti-Semitic. He really hated the Jews. So all of this kind of helps to add to the character. But he did believe in Germany, and he did believe in what Hitler could do in terms of Germany.
We know that most people don't get their history of the Nazis in Nuremberg from archives or tomes with many footnotes. They get it from TV and film.
Yes.
Does that fill you with a certain sense of responsibility when you approach a role like that? Is that on your mind?
Well, you've always got to, I mean, no one is intrinsically bad. There are some people who are probably, you know, kind of, I mean, I think Hitler definitely had a screw loose. There was no question that this was a guy who had suffered a lot of abuse as a young man, who was a painter, street painter, and also had been through the war. He'd been through the First World War, and he felt that this betrayal after the war was appalling. And it truly was what the Treaty of Versailles did to the Germans, and that's why they felt they needed to protest and eventually become very aggressive in relationship to that. And Goering was very, very pro that aggression. He wasn't necessarily, I mean, he was probably anti-Semitic. I think he probably had Jewish friends because he was actually much more bon vivant as a man, really, and that's the clue to him, is that he was fascinated by so much that was going on, and at the same time trying to keep this very strong line of National Socialism going in a way towards helping. So there was kind of two elements to him all the time, you know, and always sometimes contradictory to one another. And he understood that contradiction and he kind of rode it out.
Film, it feels to me, Brian, is inextricable from Nazism in a couple of ways, because obviously film was used by the Nazis and Goebbels to create the environment that they wanted, to portray Hitler as this messianic figure, create the German community. Then the Nuremberg trial was filmed, and it was the footage of the camps that was a really big turning point in the trial.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
then since then we've seen Nazis depicted in different sorts of ways, you know, in very almost caricature villains, satirically, and then in a more psychologically probing way, like your portrayal. Would you reflect on that?
Yeah, I think so. The thing that I chose to affect him was the camps, and there was a particular scene of the various what was going on, the filming of the camps, where a young woman's body is brought out of a grave, and her long black hair falls in a certain way, and that was the thing that touched me. That because that was a kind of harsh reality. This rather beautiful girl, Jewish clearly, who had suffered at the hands of the Germans, and that I made that affect him in his prison cell. I made him reflect on that was something that perhaps we had gone a step too far. He never admits it, he never says it, but I think from his humanistic point of view, that was something that really touched him and didn't alter who he was. It just meant that he saw what the extreme of that had been, you know, what the extreme of anti-Semitism had resulted in.
We hear the phrase applied to the Holocaust and Nazism, never again, frequently, and it's unique in historical topics because historians and experts want there to be a moral imperative. It's not just an objective analysis. Like they want people to remember and not to repeat this. And you're obviously somebody that's very politically involved and you speak out on politics. What role do you think actors play in bringing these events to life to ensure that there aren't rhymes of these atrocities in the present day?
Well, I think it's about the truth. You have to create the truth of a situation and follow that truth through.
Well, Brian Cox, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for chatting to us about that.
You're welcome.